Roxanne Barzi from the Department of Anthropology and also in Persian Studies. It's my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Mona Kia, here to the Persian Center and apparently back to her former home, Irvine, California. Currently, she's an assistant professor of Indo-Persian Studies at my alma mater, Columbia University, best place on earth, aside from Irvine, of course. Her interests are the early modern and modern connective social, cultural, intellectual histories of West, Central, South Asia from the 17th to the 19th centuries, which I think we're going to hear about tonight, maybe. And she's currently finishing a book on trans-regional Persianate sensibilities of belonging in the 18th century. She's also begun work on a project examining the relationship between early modern ethics of love and loyalty and companionship and the production of Persian texts, commonly used as source materials for the study of 18th century India. So she is very broad and interdisciplinary. She completed her PhD at Harvard, which you've probably heard of, so I won't tell you where that is, an MA at NYU, where I also taught, and a BA at Vassar College. She has also been a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for the History of Emotions at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin, another favorite city of mine. All right, so without further ado, why don't you take over?
So I want to thank everyone for coming, and thank you to the Jordan Center for inviting me here to speak. So I'm going to show you a lot of pictures, and this is beyond my technical capability, but I wanted to start just with the poster for the talk. And the image, right, comes from one of the most well-known geographical and cosmological texts, which is called Ajaib al-Makhluqat, which roughly Wonders of Creation, by Zakaria Qazvini. And this is a 13th century text, but this picture is from a late 16th century Safavid manuscript. And in this painting, the angel Ruh holds up the cosmos, right? So this text isn't what we think of as geography today, which is a science that came into being in the 19th century. Before that, texts that mapped the topographical features of the world were also filled with historical narratives of the pasts of those places, their animals, their flora, their fauna, types of people and societies. And they placed the whole of that within an understanding of the cosmos, right? Including aspects of the manifest world, such as stars and planets, as well as aspects of the hidden world, such as angels and other features of God's creation. So I point this out because I'm going to talk about these kind of texts in general more later. So in the paper I'm going to present here analyzes representations of place in 17th century texts to consider how early modern Persians made sense of the world. So I'm going to talk about a few terms, right, just to give you a kind of way to understand the title of the talk. I'm sure you all know the meaning of the word similarity. But alterity means, quote, otherness, specifically the quality or state of being radically alien to a self or a particular cultural orientation, right? It's derived from the Latin word alter, meaning the other of two. And this meaning of radical otherness is a significant concept in modern thought. It's how European thinkers, since at least the Enlightenment, if not sooner, understood the process by which individuals and collectives gain self-definition, right? So imagine this. If I am myself, then I am completely different from you in some essential way, right? And that difference becomes defining. So what I'm going to outline is the way in which experiencing difference as a Persian functioned according to gradations of similarity and a partial but not absolute difference in the early modern period. It gives us an example of an alternative form of self-definition and of relating to others. So the early modern period is usually understood as about 1500 to 1800, and it's a time when Persian was the widespread language of government, education, and high culture across Central, South, and West Asia. This was most notably the case under the Timurid rulers of India, who are generally called Mughals in English, and of course under the Safavid rulers of Iran. Persian was also significant in Central Asia, as well as the Ottoman Empire up through the 19th century, though the 17th century saw the rise of Ottoman Turkish as a medium of power. But undergirding this shared language of basic education, high culture, and power was the constant circulation of people, texts, and ideas. Now, I think that it's significant that from 1500, when the Portuguese rounded the Cape of Good Hope, Europeans were present in Asia and Africa as well. But they weren't the dominant colonial powers that they would later become in the 19th and 20th centuries. So this is in fact a kind of time of the great land-based empires of the Ottomans, the Mughals, and the Safavids, who understood themselves as Islamic and as universal, and ruled over subjects of various religions, languages, and origins, right? And that's 1600, and this is roughly 1700. We might then wonder how these people, within and between empires, who all spoke the same languages, though they had many differences between them, encountered one another and those differences, right? And I was struck by the contrast between how Persians imagined other people and places and the way Europeans did. So Edward Said is a scholar who has a kind of famous formulation of something he calls Orientalism, by which the Orient, or the East, right, of which Iran and India were both a part, was radically alien to Europe. And this radical distinction gave Europe its identity as the West, right? So imagine this. Whatever the East was, Europe was not. And in this formulation of alterity, right, there is no room for overlap or similarity. So the Persian formulation of alterity stands in contrast to Orientalism. In early modern Persianate Asia, common representations of place appear in geographical and travel writing. These represented features, which I'm going to call ornaments, adorned places that shared a learned Persian language or Muslim rule, and those places beyond in other parts of Asia and Africa. The presence or absence of these ornaments made the world intelligible for early modern Persians, creating categories of similarity and alterity that were partial, diffuse, and aporetic, right? So indistinct in a certain sense, bleeding into one another, and give us an alternative to the self-other distinctions of Orientalism. So this form of knowledge about the self and the world generated the possibility for encounters unique from those possible under both modern colonial power and the nation state. And what I want to present has a significance that's about more than the kind of othering that has made colonial interventions or the exclusionary practices of nationalism possible. It's also important for how we think about a concept that we think of as maybe the opposite of Orientalism, that of cosmopolitanism. So I'm going to let you read these two quotes, right? One is the top one, and I wanted them both on the same page. One is from Said's Orientalism, right? And the thing that I found very interesting about this question is, can one divide human reality, right? As indeed human reality seems to be genuinely divided, right? And the question I had is, for whom is it genuinely divided into clearly different cultures, histories, traditions, societies, even races, right? For whom? And then the bottom one is from Saadi's Golestan, in a kind of very long hikayat that is about the benefits of travel, right? And the dangers of travel. And this, the reason I juxtapose Said's question with a quote from what was the most widely read book of a 20th century, pre-20th century Persian education, is that these quotes kind of together urge us to consider whether the representation of difference is always radical, generating the same kind of authority over others. Saadi's character articulates the benefits of travel, among which are seeing the wondrous and the strange, taking in sights and sounds of new cities and provinces, closeness with new intimates, as well as gaining wealth, high status, knowledge, and experience of the world, right? So Persians across West, Central, and South Asia read and ruminated over this story, which was foundational to the education that defined them. Because of this shared Persianate culture, this text and its stories circulated, embedded amongst people, goods, and ideas in a dense network across Iran and India in the early modern period. Travel and circulation are also central ideas to cosmopolitanism, right? And the idea is that you enjoy travel, you enjoy meeting other people, but this is a concept with a European genealogy, right? And so the question becomes, why and according to what justification are Persianate practices or sensibilities that may share only some of the features of the European concept called cosmopolitanism? Can we universalize cosmopolitanism as significant ways in the past of being translocal, of participating and knowing one was participating in cultural and political networks that transcended the immediate community? Furthermore, if, as Anthony Pagden tells us, cosmopolitan is an idea specific to a concept of justice and manner of living rooted in a single political order, a single legal system, is a, quote, non-European expression of cosmopolitanism even possible? And I would add the question of, is it desirable, right? We all tend to kind of think that it's a good thing, right? But the question is, if it's a good thing, because extending the concept of cosmopolitanism to historical practices and sensibilities which have their own genealogies, their own sort of histories and embeddedness, right, propagates European universalism's project of writing itself large as trans-historical humanity, self-defined according to others' lack. And inherent to cosmopolitanism is a particular idea of absolute categorical difference, right? And so I want to kind of look at what we may have if we don't have absolute categorical difference. So a significant challenge to the notion of cosmopolitanism is that in the Persianate world, different political orders with their own legal systems coexisted, acknowledged, and competed with one another using the same universal notions of justice, morality, and idealized order. These were articulated and embedded in the aesthetics and ethics of proper form, or adab, of the Persian textual tradition. The gradient between the Persianate world and beyond offered a way of knowing and being that allowed for difference and contained hierarchy, but its knowledge generated an authority of intimacy without threat or will to dominate. Unlike Orientalism, Persians constituted themselves according to ethical and aesthetic ideals projected outward and used to understand new people, practices, and places. To explore the shared notions by which Persians viewed each other and their surrounding lands, I'm going to talk about two texts which were written for very different reasons, about 100 years apart at separate imperial courts, one for the Mughals and one for the Safavids. Despite such differences, these texts articulate and evoke strikingly similar forms of representation, right? So you can have one text written in Iran and one in India, and you're seeing the same sorts of ways of talking about different places being used. So, articulated according to what I call the necessary ornaments of place, features like built environment, lineages of origin, rulers, governance practices, social structure, and recognizable virtues like learning and friendship make places intelligible. However different, these features could establish varying degrees of intimacy according to Persianate ideals across Persianate and Muslim-ruled locales. These similarities could be extended to lands, then, that were neither Persian nor Muslim, with varying degrees of success. This was not a world of equality, but of possible equivalences. There was hierarchy, but certainty, which belonged to God alone, could be claimed only in degrees. And so this was a kind of apparatus of knowing that contains superiority, but for Persians, humankind could not claim the radical differences of positivistic certitude with any hope of retaining moral authority. And I'll explain a little bit more about this. So this is what I'm going to look at, this kind of three levels. I'm going to give you an example within the Persian-speaking world, right? And partly at its frontier, the Deccan in India. Then I'm going to give you an example of a kind of description of the Muslim-ruled world beyond Persianate lands in Yemen. And then I'm going to look at examples outside of both. right, of partial similarity and of alterity. So times when creating similarity was successful and times when it was not, right? So the Persianate world, the first example, right? The Persianate world's geography was narratively invested with the storied figures of the near and far past, as narrated in, for example, the universal histories of the Timurid period, which were very important. These narratives linked a reconciled pre-Islamic Persian and Quranic history as an antecedent to an Islamic history geared towards Persianate lands after the fall of the Abbasids. So examples are the late Timurid Mir Khan's Rozat al-Safa and his grandson Khan Damir's Habib al-Sayyad, right? These focused their post-Caliphate narratives on Mongol and then Turco-Mongol fortunes of the two Arabs, Arab or Ajam, and Turan, right? Khorasan, Turan, which is roughly Mesopotamia, the Iranian plateau, and Afghanistan, and Central Asia. These were some of the most widely circulated works of the early modern period, and they were ubiquitously read and cited in other texts. And they were part of the prism by which a whole host of other texts, travel, autobiographical, geographical, historical, commemorative, made sense of their subjects. So what happened when Persians, and here I mean people with the same basic education, extending well past Iran to Central and South Asian lands, right, encountered and wrote about places beyond this geocultural grid? So I think it's important to point out the obvious, that pre-modern conceptions of place are not the same as they are now. Places could be made to be close, though not in modern geographical terms. So we're not talking about the objective proximity of places. This was unnecessary for imagining their relation as familiar and contiguous, right? Alternately, and I'll explain a little bit more about that, but alternately, the climb system yoked lands under a different rubric of geographical coherence. And the literary imagination disseminated images of place throughout the Persianate world through wondrous stories and outstanding ornaments, or their lack, that could bestow a sense of proximity or distance. So places were often defined in two ways, right? One drew on notions of madaniyat or tamaddun, which meant something akin to socio-political order and proper urbane conduct. This included descriptions of rulers and or learned men and the idealized relations between them. The other drew on the status of a built environment or its builtness, including gardens. These two features animated one another. Urbane conduct was most conspicuous in men of learning, who were seen as possessors of ethical and aesthetic substance and form. Their presence could imbue a place with moral stature due to the association between learning and virtue. The association between such men in wider social harmony was prevalent in texts of ethical instruction. Learned men animated the built environment, which itself was an indicator of order and just rule. So that's ideally. So ideally, a proper Persianate place would have all of these crucial ornaments. But outside of lands marked by the narratives of Persianate history or even Muslim rule, features such as rulers, evidence of knowledge, and built environment could make places legible and familiar to Persianate audiences. In contrast, their absence meant alterity, the strange and unfamiliar. So, many of the best known texts that map places and communities were written in Mughal India by migrants from Safavid domains. And these texts would then circulate back to the cities of Iran and were read and cited in texts produced in Iran for centuries afterward, right? They evince a technique whereby the generic was used to render places familiar. And the generic is something that most modern scholars have disregarded, right, and said that it's not important, but actually there's a very important function that they serve in creating familiarity. So one such text was written in the late 16th century by Amin ibn Ahmad Razi. This is his Haftarlim. This was a widely cited and trans-regionally circulated work that scholars more often read for its biographical entries than its narrative mapping of the world. One reason is its purported lack of accurate descriptions of specific places. again, the problem that, oh, it's generic, it's not specific. But actually, that's not what people were necessarily expecting. That's what we expect. But it's precisely the way in which specific locations, represented as readily intelligible, for example, with generic descriptions of paradise, could be imagined locally, here with us, as much as elsewhere. Through these universally recognizable ornaments, generic features of place brought such descriptions to any other number of localities. So you could have new places like the Deccan marked with some of these features and made familiar. This ambiguity between the specific and the generic allowed places that shared the universal features of Persianate cities, with certain features emphasized in reference to a locality, to be inducted into Persianate geocultural space. So the Haft Iqlim is divided into 7 climes containing their respective countries and then cities under which its great men are listed, and this is just Bozorgan. Some geographical places, mostly in the outside climes, are devoid of biographies and contain only geographical and historical descriptions. So Amin al-Razi narratively maps the known world, sometimes through descriptions of wonders that make a place strange, sometimes through men of learning that make a place familiar, and sometimes by creating familiarity through the strangeness of such wonders. So I'm going to give you the example from the Deccan, right? In the Haft Iqlim, the place of Ahmadnagar, and that's here, right? And this is the same thing whereby the main city gives the name to the region. So the place of Ahmadnagar and the Deccan more generally takes shape as a site of forts and gardens. These are the kind of things specific to the locality, both characterized by their towering fastness. Razi tells us that the Deccan is a place where, quote, all needs can be easily met from within its domain, and that its air opens the bud of the heart's hope. The verse that follows specifically notes the paradise-like, garden-esque nature of its water and air, yani Abahaba, before moving on to its hundreds, and he gives us the number 360, of impenetrable skyscraping forts. This vision of firm and deft construction, described in wondrous terms, also characterizes descriptions of Ahmadnagar itself, though in the context of topoi specific to the city. So he begins, of all the cities of the Deccan, it is exceptional on account of its water and air and the particularities of its hills and plains. On the outskirts of the city, there are several continuously flowing subterranean canals, which have not been produced in India until now. One among the gardens within those pleasing borders is the Garden of Farah-Bakhsh, which is incomparable. So the Farah-Bakhsh garden is iconically mentioned in tandem with Ahmadnagar in the decades that follow. This is a kind of feature by which it's known. Razi further gives it meaning by making it analogous to the Garden of Abaddon, right? The legendary earthly garden as beautiful as the heavenly one. Because of its pond, and he talks about a wondrous structure defying engineering knowledge. And I've given you the verse, right? In grace and light, it is heaven. In elegance and beauty, it is Abaddon. In grandeur and power, it is the heavens. In length and breadth, it is the earth. Immediately following this verse is a description of an impenetrable fort on one side of the city, which, quote, kings have given up all hope of taking, and the hand of calamity has fallen short of its skirt. For a Persianate audience, this repeated attention to the strength, dimensions, and skill of the built environment signified a settled and prosperous kingdom under idealized rule. Indeed, Amin al-Razi repeatedly uses the word ma'mur, right, paired with the word Abaddon, to describe places in the Deccan evoking grandeur or eminence of rulers through detailed descriptions of buildings and gardens. And gardens are kind of the open-air counterparts of buildings. They have to be built by man. So now what happens beyond, right? Narrative techniques connecting non-contiguous places challenge the application of modern categories for understanding historical imaginings of place. The Haftarim mapped the world according to a system that linked regions within the Mughal kingdom, along with Safavid domains and beyond, in the central and most desirable climes, the third and the fourth climes, right? So in the climb system, and I'll show you some maps, this kind of cuts up and separates what are political kingdoms and brings pieces of them together, right? But what happened in the outlying climes, which were also outside of the Persianate? So unlike latitude, climes were arcs drawn across the known earth, moving south to north. And for example, the first climb includes Yemen, East Africa, the Sudan, Sri Lanka, and China, right? And so this is the kind of, this is the outermost layer of lands around the Indian Ocean. So one of the kind of early things that people talk about is that in the kind of early Islamic and medieval period, you had two separate systems. One was the Kissoff System, and this is a sort of example of it. That's the English. It's a little bit neater. Right, you have Iran Shah in the middle, and then you have the other climes around it. And then they talk also about, this is another common way of mapping, right, where you have Junub at the top and Shomal at the bottom. And this is very common, like from the kind of context of the ancient world onward. I'm not going to ask you to read this map. Here's the English version, right? So here you sort of have, you still have the land of Iran in the middle here. You may notice, right?
Yeah.
Now, after about the 13th century, these systems become merged. So this is the climb system, right? And then this is Zakaria Ghazvini's, this is one of his maps, which combines the climb and the Kishvat idea, right? And here's a more helpful version. So you see here, you have the first climb, and basically it kind of goes here, here, Chin, right? And then the second climb, and the third, and the fourth. Well, within this first climb, places are heterogeneous, right? Do you remember? It's East Africa, Yemen, Sudan, Sri Lanka, China, right? These places are heterogeneous. They're marked by differences as well as characteristics of affinity. So Amina Dozy explains that, quote, the common inhabitants of this climb are black colored, close quote. And that the section will begin with Yemen, and he describes Yemen as, quote, where the candle for those for whom it was a homeland is illuminated by the light of Islam and faith. And he said, and basically Yemen, which is a place where the light of Islam shines, has few biographical entries of great men adorning its cities, right? Most of the ones that are there are God's friends, right, awliya, from early Islamic times, and none of them wrote in Persian. The region itself is introduced, rather, by a long historical narrative, and its inhabitants' lineages are given as from Psalm ibn Nuh, with its king, a crucial ornament of place, descended from the prophet Hud, right? So you have, nevertheless, certain things, even though you have no Persian men of learning, you have certain things which make this a recognizable and legible place. So the first name in this kingly lineage is Yarab ibn Qahtan, who is, quote, the first person to converse in the Arabic tongue, right? This is another thing that originates from the Yemen, right? Yemen is further, and I think I have a map here. This is actually supposed to be from Yemen, but we all know Yemen is here. Yes. So the way in which you have Yemen represented through the kind of humorial understanding of several porous factors, right, which give meaning to this land: the character of its ruler, the nature of his sovereignty, and the manners of the inhabitants, right? Kingly lineage is the progenitor not just of language, but also of people, since, quote, the Arabs of Yemen have all appeared from the lineage of Qahtan, So such delineations of origin locate Yemen outside of the Persianate, but still identify a Muslim place. But ornaments could also make non-Muslim places continuous with Muslim lands. So Razi describes today's Sri Lanka, which was called Sarandeep, as an island in the Indian Ocean that has, quote, several mines of gold, silver, rubies, and diamonds. And this is Sri Lanka down there. Sarandeep, actually. So Sarandeep's most noteworthy feature, however, is the large footprint of Adam alighting to earth from heaven atop one of its mountains, right? And for Buddhists, this is the Buddha. This is the Buddha's footprint, right? But for others, this becomes Adam's footprint. So this is a place, this place where the footprint is at the top of the mountain is a place of magical properties, and it's described as having constant light and nightly showers that wash the footprint. And the last detail explicitly cites Ajaib literature, invoked in a way that associates Sarandeep with the ambit of Islam, right? And it says the author of the book, Ajaib al-Buldan, has claimed that in the vicinity of Sarandeep there is a tree from which a leaf falls every dawn. On one side there are the words, "There is no God but God, and Muhammad is God's messenger." And on the other side is painted a verse from the Quran. The king of that land has preserved them, the leaves, and they have enabled recovery from all troubles and calamities. Right? So not only are the otherwise unbelieving inhabitants of Sarandeep distinguished by a wondrous occurrence linking them to Islam, right? But they also have a king who recognizes the talismanic power of the blessed words of God. So wonders of creation as a mode of narration have a long history across the Muslim world. Persis Burlekamp notes a shift in the emphasis in wonders literature after the Mongol conquest of Baghdad. 13th century manuscripts representing the cosmological order of the universe through natural wonders gave way, along with a shift in language to Persian translations and texts, to representation of wonders emphasizing human works. These included monuments as well as the variety of peoples and their social configurations. Human agency in the cosmological order took center stage and blended this genre with geography. By the early modern period, these stories imbued other texts, such as tazkiras like Haftarlim, and travel texts like Safineh Soleimani, which I'll talk about in a minute. Engendered by incorporation of the Eastern Islamic world into a Mongol imperium linked to non-Muslim domains, the wonders of creation became a lens through which to marvel at the world and a means by which to understand encounters with the unfamiliar. So Zakaria Ghazvini, whose influential text I mentioned earlier, defined wonder as a state, quote, of bewilderment a person feels because of his inability to understand the cause of a thing. Though these things are beyond familiar experience, quote, and he admits, include things whose truth the reader might doubt, nevertheless, quote, nothing is beyond God's power, right? So the seemingly fantastical was also a way to encounter the incomprehensible real or confusingly different. The real may have been hard to believe, but its unverifiability preserved the line between human agency and divine creation. Not all natural wonders, however, granted the same intimacy. Articulated alongside the presence, perversion, or absence of man-made ornaments, some places became unfamiliarly strange and explicitly inferior. And so this is a way in which it kind of doesn't work in inclusion, right? So Aminat Azi describes Zanj, right, which is broadly understood as East Africa, as a spacious velayat that borders, quote, the great cities of the Yemen. To the north, Sudan to the east, and Ethiopia to the west, Habsha. But this proximity, this actual proximity, right, to Yemen means little. Razi goes on to note that an outstanding characteristic of the Zanjis is that the people of this province are never sad. So this seemingly positive trait, however, makes them suitable for slavery. The cause for their joy, according to the wise ones, is, quote, the prominence of the star of Canopus, which rises every night over where that group lives. This propensity for slavery is a state written into the structure of the universe. It is destiny linked to their particular location, not the skin color the Zanji share with the others in the first climb, right? So this is a kind of different idea of destiny. In the absence of bozorgan, right, or great men, the rest of the description features their Quranic lineage from Zanj ibn Kush ibn Kanan ibn Hissam. And these lineages are very important, right? And they sort of link all people together in the end. But the Zanji's other prominent feature is their propensity to eat human flesh. As Amin al-Razi narrates, they engage in this practice when either victorious over enemies or when oppressed by their king. To a late 16th century Persianate audience, for whom the king sits atop the socio-political order, maintaining stability and harmony among social groups, and conduits of divine authority, right, as the shadow of God in the absence of prophets, this was a truly horrifying practice. Unsurprisingly, we are also told that, quote, even though there is a great deal of gold in that province, they make their decorative ornaments from iron and say that whomever has iron cannot be touched by Satan and will grow increasingly brave. Close quote. So lack of men of learning or an impressively built environment express lack of virtue or just rule. Even wondrous features associated the land not with the correct precepts of Islam, but with ridiculous and superstitious behavior. Thus, the heavens create people whose actions preclude consistent kingship, strong sovereignty, and protection from capture, for which their location renders them suitable. But association with Islam need not ornament place. So Amin al-Razi describes Chin's idolatry, but then discusses its well-known excellence in painting, right? And this is a clear reference to the Alexander legends articulated, for instance, in Nizami's Iskandar-Nameh, right, where Alexander debates and competes with renowned Chinese painters. Next is mention of the false prophet Mani, who managed to seduce even the Chinese with his beautiful pictures. While Qin is not under Muslim rule, nor does it possess any great men of Persianate learning, Amin al-Razi makes it familiar through reference to tales of storied figures from the Persianate past. They have a king, as well as political practices such as royal audiences open once a year to both high and low. To be sure, these are strange ceremonies involving axes and wood, but they nevertheless are recognizable as kingship practices. There are wonders of human effort and not nature. For instance, it is known that in that region they have built a chariot from wood that without the movements of the mover, this is a little confusing, moved as much as they wanted, and without any discernible signal would stop again according to when its masters wanted, right? So magic remote control chariots. Other details note that their king is from the Mongol people and that a great river passes through their capital city, right? So these are all features of something we would call now as civilization. So I'm going to skip over the other Chinese example. So descriptions of China use wonders, amazing stories, and information about places that read to us like facts. But these modes of knowing the world are distinct from the positivistic claims of Orientalism. This Persianate view of the world pulls from a previous textual tradition, like the late Ilkhani Jame al-Tawarikh about the Yuan dynasty. So this textual tradition has an authority that derives partly from iteration, repetition, and its own widespread textual travel. Its iterative authority, naqli authority, right, allows geographical accounts to lie easily alongside wondrous, legendary, and historical stories. For Persians, all of these tales are testaments that require selective representation and homage, because in their own ways, they are all part of the truth, which in the end, only God knows, right? So this is the kind of understanding of certitude. The Haftaklim's trans-political ubiquity gave it an authority that does not map onto a single empire, or the kind of knowing linked to a will to dominate, either at its time of writing as a Mughal text, or in the subsequent centuries of its broader circulation. Furthermore, it exhibited features similar to texts authored for and limited to the Safavid court, in which some places were adorned with the necessary ornaments that made them either legibly familiar or strange to varying degrees. Ornaments of place are also the representational imagery of first-hand travel narratives, right? So I'm going to talk about a late 17th century account of Thailand written by a Persian from Safavid, Iran, which illuminates the close coincidence of textual encounters, right? A geographical text that somebody writes using a library, and narrated experiences. A travel text that supposedly is somebody's experience going to someplace. So here's the route the mission took, right? And they go from Bandar Abbas. They stopped in the Deccan because there was a pretty close relationship between the Deccanate sultanates and Iran, and then they went to Thailand, and I'll explain why in a minute. So here, travel experience is narrated through the same representational practices that we saw in Hafdeplim. In both types of texts, aesthetic forms, such as the proximate or distancing qualities of ajaib, become the lens through which place is narrated. And perhaps because experience consists of narration to oneself, right? First you have to explain to yourself what's going on. Also, this is a lens through which things can be experienced. Because according to what language do you narrate what is happening to yourself? After all, textualization is also mediated re-narration of experience. But to become legible experience, one had to narrate to oneself first. So Safineh Soleimani opens with an account, here's a little information, of the failed Safavid diplomatic mission to Thailand. And this was in response to 2 previous trade delegations sent from Thailand because there had been the settlement of Iranian merchant communities in Thailand, and a couple of those families had risen to fairly high positions in the Thai court by the second half of the 17th century. And so they had encouraged, these were mainly trade missions, to open up diplomatic relations. But there was a kind of problem by the time the return mission was sent. There had been a change in power relations, and the high Iranian official had fallen from power, right? Mohammad Rabi blamed the Iranians' ineptitude. So this text is written by Mohammad Rabi, right, who's the Safavid court munshi appointed to keep a record of the mission. In his narrative, the Thai court is held responsible for the mission's failure in a way that illustrates Persianate ideas of rulership, collective character of its inhabitants, and the land itself, demonstrating that what we now understand as objective geography is partly a matter of politics, too, right? And this begins with the mission's framing. So just as the hamd, or the opening praises that often situate the cosmological orientation of the text, the author and the patron within it, describes God as the God of all men, quote, who can harmoniously regulate the world and the state of the sons of Adam, so too is the prophet the bearer of a universal message, right? The next object of praise is the king, and obviously in this case it's the Safavid Shah Suleiman, who in the vein of the shadow of God on earth is the universal king. He is thus, quote, the standard for kingly conduct, right? Nazim adab shahanshahi, because, quote, he is the distributor of God's bounties, a conduit between God and humanity, and God's representative to other kings. So the Safavid Shah's duties in the world inform the mission's imperative, and it's kind of made as the framing of the text. Diplomacy is discussed in the language of friendship, giving a moral cast to the act of connecting with non-Muslim kings and travel to their domains. Thus, while the Thai are ultimately found wanting, travel and engagement with the place are the prerogatives of universal kingship. So most discussions of this text highlight its belittling of Thai customs, people, and officials. But this text seeks to make the disastrous diplomatic mission to the Thai court accountable to the Safavid court. And someone or something had to take the blame, right? Apart from accounts of the people, their practices, the court, and its governance, narrated as responsible for the failure of the mission, other parts of the text evoke a different picture. And you can see this in the way the land itself is described as paradise-like, right? Indeed, after a comparatively brief account of the mission, which is a very small part of the text, largely concerned with showing how the embassy and the royal document with Shah Suleiman's seal, this is very important, were treated, most of the text is actually a geographical, social, and historical account of Thailand, including extensive discussion of the islands and sea between it and Iran, as well as the wonders encountered en route and at the destination. So the rather long account of the islands includes Sarandib, the Andamans, the Philippines, even Japan. That these sections draw heavily on previous geographical accounts and wonders literature and are written according to their models should alert us to the indispensability of the textual tradition to authorizing the travel account, narrating the experiential and framing subsequent encounters of place. We may even ask if this is really a text of experience, right? Like other texts, it's constituted by politics justifying the encounter between representatives of the Safavid throne and an unfamiliar place. So this encounter demonstrates the limits of Persianate inclusion, but in a very interesting way, right? Like Amin Razi's description of Zanj, the place is made legible, but with limited lackluster ornaments of place. So inclusion becomes uneasy and partial. Thailand has a king whose practices, such as advisors, are comprehensible to the author, though one advisor is a woefully incompetent Irani and the other is a dastardly European. The king has a routine, for instance, but everything is done correctly, right? So he's basically shown as sleeping at the wrong time and holding audience at the wrong time, but he still does all of those things, right? However, I would argue that this representation of Thailand does not present a hard line of difference, yielding chaos and incomprehensibility. And the examples I want to give you in particular are the way in which he discusses the names of the land and the lineage of the inhabitants. And here in these two sections, Muhammad Rabi attempts to narrate according to universal Persian notions. So in the case of the names of the land, he starts drawing on famous geographical accounts, and he states the various reasons that the region is known as Machin, right? A place geographically understood to be near China, Machin is understood in the geographic literature to be extremely large, built, and flourishing, and he uses Bozorg, Ma'mur, Abaddon. Muhammad Rabi describes the origin of the capital city's name, which is extended to the kingdom, and that's Shahreno, but also notes that the residents themselves call it Ayutthaya, and the Europeans call it Siam. So Muhammad Rabi acknowledges that the city may in fact be in the land of Machin, though, quote, in the end, only God knows, right? Which I really wish was an out for us writing at this time. But we can't say that. Here, the written tradition and the assertion of others, and he cites, for instance, travelers from Iran, and this was a very common practice, link Thailand to the built and prosperous land that Machin is known to be, yet this linkage is ultimately uncertain. However much Muhammad Rabi wishes to discredit the connection, right, because he kind of paints the Thai in a bad light, he cannot cast it aside, as the truth of received tradition Onkenaklas cannot be discounted by a single mere man's authority, right? Such a connection is in stark contrast to the denigration he heaps on Thai people, rulers, and practices. This uncertain and uneasy incorporation of Thailand into Persianate modes of knowing is further reflected in Muhammad Rabi's attempts to reconcile local knowledge with universal Persian genealogical origins. Right, and so this is a quote, right? So the people of Iran and Europe call the residents of Shahreno Siam. They, the Thai, know themselves as descended from the line of Tai, whom they count as one of their genies, right? Jinns. They relate many varnished and tall tales about their lineage that do not seem to come together to make any sense. Although they do not connect themselves with Adam's line, in submission to divine fate, the people of Iran who are in Siam think that it is possible that their lost lineage could be from San ibn Yapet ibn Nu, because those people and then he sort of goes on to explain that. And then he says, because those people are very weak in speaking their language, and let their words fall without pronouncing or distinguishing most of the letters from one another. And he says, and I've put the periods in, right? Obviously in the original text there's no punctuation. Nun and mim are pronounced alike, so that this is son that has come to be pronounced Siam, right? So he's trying to fit them in a Quranic lineage. And then he says, another theory held by chroniclers is that Siamak ibn Kiamaz had children, and that the Siam lineage is connected to Siamak. Over the course of time, and poor pronunciation, the lineage became Siam, right? And so he gives it a Quranic lineage and a pre-Islamic Persian lineage, right? So he's going to make these people connected to Adam's line, whether they want to be or not. Again, Muhammad Rabi concludes that only God knows the truth, right? He attempts to discard the demonic origins professed by the Thai and reconcile them with the universal cosmography of the origins of humanity. He notes that the Thai do not connect themselves as connected to Adam's line, which is tantamount to disconnection from the monotheistic conception of humanity. Muhammad Rabi tries his best to explain how they are nevertheless part of this family, right? Drawing on authorities such as learned chronicles and locally resident Persians, he can at least cast doubt on Thai claims that undermine the universality of his Persianate understanding of Muslim history. He's only partially successful since in a world full of God's wonders, humans can never obtain absolute certainty. Perhaps the outstanding feature of such narrations is this inescapable encounter with the local, which are more easily burnished out of representations of place for which Muhammad Rabi might have been a source. And in the Haftarnim, we know that Amin Razi is definitely drawn on travel narratives in writing his text as well. So instead, through the lens of the wonders of creation, humans can marvel but not master, right? So Persian speakers exist in Thailand, and some even hold positions of rank through the kingdom, but their presence is only enough to spread some knowledge of lifestyle habits. The text's overwhelming pronouncement is on the formless and senseless practices of the Thai and their king. These practices are not always directly linked to a lack of Islam or even a recognizable monotheism. For instance, even though he decries their marriage practices, such as a lack of marriage contracts and more generally a sense of, quote, what is sanctioned and what is forbidden, right, halal va haram, he compares them not to Muslims, but to Hindus, who, quote, will not consider marrying a girl until she is at least 7 generations distant, close quote, right? The Thai, by contrast, he says, marry their closest relatives, such as milk siblings or daughters or their children. So such practices constitute legible alterity and not nonsensicality. And it's very interesting that instead of comparing them to Muslims, he compares them to Hindus, right? So he's not trying to make them in comparison to that. So I'm going to give you one last example and then I'll wrap it up. Thank you for your patience. So such practice, though the Thai, this is the example, though the Thai have the means of carrying out ordinances in the context of law courts, quote, the end of investigations and prosecutions, which seem as if it references the term humanity, is a meaningless term with this group. So he'll make these broad statements like that, but then in spite of the declaration of Thai legal practices as subhuman, what follows is in fact a detailed description of how legal complaints were resolved and how these involved petitions, plaintiffs, defendants, an official adjudicating body, recorded testimony, careful scrutiny, and deliberation. And then he says, but because, quote, amongst these people it is extremely shameful for a person to lose a legal dispute, if the two parties are powerful, the dispute devolves without resolution, with either side dragging it out to keep from losing face, right? As a result, the two sides are never willing to have their documented cases weighed so that their claims may be compared and the truth become clear from lies. This is a description of alterity that marks difference, inferiority, and antithetical outcomes, not the lack of a recognizable system, though, right? So the necessary ornaments of place are part of Persianate modes of inclusion applied beyond the familiar geocultural grid. Inclusion had little to do with proximity in the modern geographic sense, and more to do with familiar features that offered recognition, legibility, and affinity. The beyond thus represents not radical alterity, but variable gradations of unfamiliarity. Places could remain partially connected to a central Persianate world through wondrous features associated with Islam or the urbanity of a built environment that bestowed a place with system, order, and some modicum of good rulership, however strange and different. But without these ornaments, places were legible only as unfamiliar alterity. Understanding this beyond in its own terms, Persians allowed the strange to have varying degrees of familiarity. A hermeneutics of legibility, as such, was shared across texts, even when the specifics of that legibility may differ. Or, as Mozaffar Alam and Sanjay Subramaniam have noted, there was a common way of, quote, defining the unfamiliar in terms of the familiar. These shared techniques of representing place provided a Persianate readership with a map of the world, whether wondrous or strange, impressive or disappointing. Here, difference by itself was not threatening. Thank you.